Hi, welcome back to Extending and Expanding Notions of Family in the Interpersonal and Family Communication Classroom. I'm Jimmie Manning, Professor and Chair of Communication Studies at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I have to tell you, it is a cold day here in Reno. It is gray outside, it is gloomy, it is mid-May. It is not supposed to be this way in Reno, Nevada. I'm cold, I have my sweater on, but nevertheless, I am very excited to be with you all today so we can move right into session 2 and talk about identity and difference in family communication studies. And there are two goals that I have for this session. First, I want to talk to you all about readings that I really believe will be helpful to students in the family communication classroom, both in terms of thinking about family identities and the identities of family members. Two of these readings are book chapters that come from a brand new book that I'm excited to talk about a little bit later. And then the third is one that is an oldie but goodie, and one that not a lot of family communication scholars seem to know about. And so I thought it was great to include it here because I think this is a reading that should be part of the family communication canon, and that should be considered by especially graduate students or those who are studying and researching family communication. My second goal for this session is to share an activity and an assignment with you that are related to thinking about family differences. And these are both classroom tested activities that can work at either the undergraduate or the graduate level. All right, so moving along right to goal number 1, readings on identity and difference. The first reading that I have to share with you today comes from Tina Harris and colleagues, and it's called Negotiating and Communicating About Identity Within Multi-Ethnic and Multiracial Families. And it's in the new book from Jordan Solis and Colleen Colliner called Navigating Relationships in the Modern Family, Communication, Identity, and Difference. This is a great chapter. I know I learned a lot from reading it, and I suspect a lot of other people will as well. But there are 3 features of the chapter that I think will make it especially good in both undergraduate and graduate classrooms. First, the chapter moves discussion beyond interracial families and into multi-ethnic and multiracial families and family members. And so a lot of times, if you probably have noticed that if you're reading literature about family communication, or especially textbooks that deal with race and family, a lot of times they'll kind of stop at interracial families and not get into the nuances or not look deeper. And so one thing I really appreciated about this chapter is that it shared a lot of research and summarized and provided new ideas about multi-ethnic and multiracial families and the family members and how they communicate. And to that point, a second benefit of this chapter that I think works really well is that it provides many clear and nuanced explanations of complex concepts. So let me give you 2 examples of that. One concept was a concept that was new to me, and that's the concept of internal stressors. And internal stresses are pretty much what the name implies. They're things that people have inside of them that cause turmoil or cause them to feel anxiety, or as the name says, stresses them out, right? And a lot of times, as the chapter points out, multi-ethnic or multiracial children are feeling a lot of internal stressors, particularly related to their identity, both as that identity fits within the family and as that identity fits within the larger world. And so one example that the chapter gives that I thought was pretty illuminating was the example of a child who has 2 parents that are each of a different race. And so within that family unit, they might see themselves as multiracial and feel like that's their identity. But then when they go outside of that family unit and communicate with others, people might see them as only one race. And so that causes a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion about identity, and raises a lot of questions. And so that is just one of many interesting concepts that relates back to family communication that I'm not used to seeing in a chapter that deals with race and family communication. And then there are other concepts that are more likely to be brought up in family communication literature and family communication studies of race, such as intrafamilial racism, but nevertheless, there's a lot of care given to these concepts. So this chapter is going to be one that, although it is highly readable for both undergraduates and graduates, really gets into the literature and the research and in a nuanced way. And then finally, another great aspect of this chapter is that it's translational. And by that, I mean the whole last section of the chapter talks about ways that people who are reading about these studies and reading what is happening in the research can take that information and take that knowledge and apply it in their everyday life, or if they're a practitioner, apply it in those ways as well. That translational quality is a similar feature to a lot of the chapters in the book that comes from. And I mentioned this book earlier. It's called Navigating Relationships in the Modern Family, Communication, Identity, and Difference. This book is brand new. So this session is supposed to be released in mid-June. And so that's about the time this book is supposed to come out. So this, I wasn't being hyperbolic. Some of these readings really are hot off the press. And so this particular book I think is great. I'm really excited to use it in my family communication graduate seminar, because what they do in this book is they go through and they look at a lot of different kinds of families. And when I say different kinds of families, I don't just mean identity oriented. So it's not just queer families or multi-ethnic families, but they look at families such as foster families or divorced families, and kind of look at these differences across families and how they navigate, as the title would imply, how they navigate their relationships. And so it's a really good book. Highly recommend. I gotta read an advanced copy because I had a chapter in it, and that chapter is queering family communication. And so that's the next reading that I want to discuss for today. And this chapter has 3 features that I think can be useful in a family communication classroom. One of these features that I'm going to point out is not central to the chapter, but based on experience from teaching in the classroom, students tend to like it. So one, this chapter provides a history of LGBTQ family studies in the communication discipline. It looks at some of the random studies that happened earlier on, but it especially focuses on the 90s when family communication studies really started to pick up. It looks at the work of Pamela Lanuti as she starts to look at same-sex marriage. It picks up the work of Beth Suter as she starts to look at lesbian-headed households and other queer families. And so one of the things that I really try to lay out there is here's the history of studying LGBTQ people and family communication, especially as it applies to interpersonal and family communication studies. Second, there is a section in this book, in this chapter, that talks about what queer families can teach heteronormative families. This is what I was referring to earlier when I said one of the elements is actually a very small part of the chapter, but it's been my experience that students love to discuss this. And so I don't even remember how this originally came up, but I was in one class and there was this debate that started up about, do straight families have anything to teach queer families and vice versa? And so I said, well, let's look at the empirical literature. And that's exactly what happens in this chapter. And so there are a lot of queer family lessons that can be taught. And by that, I mean things that we can look at that are happening with queer families that aren't happening with heteronormative families. So for instance, queer families, it is empirically established, appreciate the more ludic and pleasurable aspects of life. And so they're more spontaneous. They tend to do things they enjoy more and kind of allow themselves to have pleasure in comparison to heteronormative families. Also, queer families are much better about sharing domestic labor. Part of that, you could probably guess, because if you don't have a husband and wife, then you can't really have people doing those chores. But it's not that one person assumes what a wife would typically do and one person assumes what a husband would typically do. The research shows that a lot of times this labor is more evenly split amongst queer couples. And then partner jealousy is also less of an issue in queer families. And so in heteronormative families, a lot of times if one partner notices that another person is attractive outside of that couplehood, the other partner will get upset about that. But in queer relationships, a lot of times one partner will say, oh, wow, they're cute. And the other person will be like, yeah, they really are. Yeah, they're hot, right? And so let's check them out together. So anyway, that's just a fun little excursion that happens in class, and then gets people to thinking, it's not necessarily that one type of family is better than the other, but if we're in dialogue with each other, there are things we can learn. And then another feature of this chapter is that it introduces and explains queer and queer theory. And a lot of people confuse LGBTQ studies with queer theory, and the two are very different things. So LGBTQ studies means that you're doing some kind of research that involves lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer people, whereas queer theory is a way of thinking about gender and sexualities. All right, and to that point, the next reading that I want to introduce as part of this session is E. Patrick Johnson's Queer Studies, or Almost Everything I Know About Queer Studies I Learned from My Grandmother. And this is an article that was published in Text and Performance Quarterly. And unfortunately, a lot of family communication scholars do not seem to be aware of this article. And so that's why I wanted to feature it here, because I think this article has a lot of great features that will be beneficial to family communication researchers, teachers, and students. So 3 benefits of the article. Number 1, it offers an intersectional approach to difference. And by that, I mean, you can kind of see how I had the reading set up this way. So the first reading was about race. The second reading was about queer identity. But this third reading is both about race and queer identity. And so it gets into what Kimberly Crenshaw calls that intersectional approach to thinking about difference. And so E. Patrick Johnson, who's the author of this study, Dr. Johnson is not just gay and he's not just Black. You can't separate the two out. He's both gay and Black. And you see that in a very meaningful way in this article as it applies to his conversations with his grandmother and his conversations about family more generally. And then it also applies to many of the points he brings up. So as just one example, he brings up the point that a lot of times if somebody is white, they might have the affordance of being able to leave a family behind if that family is homophobic. And so if white people face a lot of scrutiny or they face a lot of discrimination within their family unit, they might say, okay, you know what, check please, I'm out, I'm leaving. As Johnson points out, Black people don't always have that affordance or that privilege. And so because racism is such a big thing in culture, and because we know that there's discrimination and violence that are enacted from racism, Black people don't necessarily have the choice, if they're queer, to just say bye to their family, because they might need that family for support in a racist society and in a racist cultures. And then beyond that, there's also kind of this sense that, you know, maybe a family member is being homophobic to you, but if you're a person of color, you also might recognize that, hey, we still have this other area that we're both discriminated against in, and so we have to have some kind of solidarity there. And so I am not explaining it near as eloquently or clearly as he does, but that's why you need to read this article, because he really gets into some of those intersectional complexities and helps, at least he helped me to think a lot about difference in families. Second, this article displays how family is tied to larger social institutions. And so I've shared this article with a couple of people, and sometimes they'll say things like, you know, I don't know why you think this is a family communication article. The beginning's about family and the end's about family, but none of the middle is. And I would say that's a very white, privileged read of the middle of the article. Because what Johnson does in this article is he interrogates not only what is happening in his family by showing vivid representations of conversations he had with his grandmother or other family instances, but he's also looking at how that ties into larger cultural institutions. And so families are part of a community, and communities are a part of a city, and so on and so forth, right? And so it's not just the family unit that he's looking at, but he's looking at kind of this notion of queer, because he calls it queer theory, because he sees that, you know, queer theory doesn't always align with people of color's interests. He kind of takes it there, right? And so there is this notion within the article that family is tied to larger social institutions, and the article shows that pretty well. But third, the article does a beautiful job of demonstrating family communication in action. And so at the beginning of the article, you see a conversation with his grandmother, and that's the same way that he ends the article. And so you get a sense of seeing that family communication happen and feeling it and sensing it and so on and so forth. As you can tell, I think this is a great article, and if you haven't read it already, I definitely highly recommend that you do. That article that I just talked about, even though E. Patrick Johnson doesn't call it autoethnography, has a lot of personal narrative combined with theorizing. If that's something that is of interest to you, I have a great book to recommend. It's called On Writing Families, Autoethnographies of Presence and Absence, Love and Loss. It's edited by Jonathan Wyatt and Tony E. Adams, and it's available from Sense Publishers. And what this book does is it collects a lot of different autoethnographies that deal with families. And so these autoethnographies tell their personal stories, they blend in theorizing, they blend in some of the extant literature, and they do it in such an accessible, beautiful, and interesting way that I have found that both undergraduate students and graduate students love this book. I'm about to teach an undergraduate family communication class this summer, and this is one of the textbooks that I've adopted for it. So another highly recommended resource. All right, so getting into the activity and assignment for the week. The first that I have to share is a difference in family autoethnography paper assignment. And so I'm just going to run you through the structure of the assignment, and then I'll comment a little bit on it. First, as part of the assignment, students are asked to share a story that illustrates a time when they realized that their family was different. And so in this paper, I want the students to find a moment when they're like, my family is not like other families. Next, students are asked to discuss that story, preferably using class readings to help them make sense of it. So I want them to unpack it and think about what's there. And so as one example that I share with my students, I talk about a time when when I went to a slumber party, I was surprised at how the family that was hosting the slumber party ate dinner together. And so I asked the kid who invited me over, I was 7 years old, is that how you usually eat dinner, or is it just because we're over for a slumber party? And he goes, no, like we never eat dinner at the table. And then I spent the night over at his house 3 weeks later, and he was right. The mom just basically put some food out. The family just came and got it when they wanted. Me and the kid like ended up going to the table, getting some food, and going and sitting in his room and eating it on the floor. And so that's just not like my family. And so I realized, not all families eat dinner the same way. So that's a little mundane thing, but that's where the second part comes in. I have to unpack that a little bit. And so I can maybe talk about the ritual literature, or the bonding literature, or there's a lot of different literatures that I can talk about in the context of that story. And so that's what I encourage the students to do. I do limit the paper to 5 pages, not including references. A lot of students at the undergraduate level think that's really long, but I believe that it's important that they try to write about it in a way that is meaningful. And so a lot of times I used to have it be 2 or 3 pages. They would basically tell their story and be done. That ensures there's enough space that they're probably going to run out of story, and they have to get into those concepts and those theories that you want them to bring into the paper to kind of make sense of their experience. One thing that I make sure to do with this assignment is ensure confidentiality. I think that's so important because even though I shared a mundane example, a lot of students share highly personal stories as part of this assignment. And so I just want them to know anything you write into that paper and submit to me, I'm not sharing with anyone. I won't like point out in class that you shared that or elements of that story. And so students want to have that assurance. And so I try to give it to them. And then it is helpful to give examples. So I just gave it one example of realizing that it was different the way my family ate dinner. I give them a couple of other examples as well so they can get a sense of what this can look like, and that they can either deal with something that's super mundane and maybe not that extraordinary to something that's maybe bigger or more meaningful or maybe more hurtful. And so there's a lot of latitude for where they can take this paper assignment. I do like to unpack this paper assignment beyond, so I don't just have the students write it and turn it in and dialogue with them on the page. I try to do that in the class as well. And so one way I do that is allow students to volunteer if they want to share their story. And so I'll ask, does anyone want to share their story? And then I'll ask them about the theories or concepts from the class that they included in it. Another way to unpack this is to get students to think about how communication was involved with helping them to understand that their family is different. And so I find that a lot of students, when I present research or when we do readings that look at communication within families, they have an easy time understanding that. But by kind of flipping this assignment a little, they're going to get how communication from others might have helped them to realize that their family is different. And thus that communication helps to shape or constitute or create the notion of who the family is. And then another thing to think about, I asked them, do you think difference is a good thing or a bad thing for families? And that's kind of a maybe silly question or loaded question, but it's a very productive question, especially in the context of this paper, because what happens is a lot of students will say things like, oh no, difference is wonderful and diversity is good and we want all kinds of different families. And so I like to ask a question at some point in that discussion, if it's so good and it's so wonderful and we want so much of it, why do we know that there's so much hurt in the world when people see families that are different than theirs? So if this is such a good thing, what leads to that? And so that can lead to some really interesting discussions that students try to unpack how difference is interpreted in everyday life versus how when maybe we're looking at difference as a class exercise. All right. Moving into an activity that I want to share with you all, this is the Family Facts Scavenger Hunt. And this is the way this activity goes down. First, I put students into pairs. Second, I provide students with a list of family-oriented facts that they are tasked with finding. And I usually give them about 10 to find, and then I like to mix up the order. That way you have different students starting with different facts. And so if they don't have time to find all 10 facts that are part of their scavenger hunt, the class will still have it covered because some of them were starting at the bottom, others at the top, and so on and so forth. These facts are things like questions such as how many marriages end in divorce, or how many children are adopted each year. So facts like that where they can go and find a very certain answer. After a predetermined amount of time, I usually go about 10 minutes, I reconvene the entire class, and then I draw 2 columns on the board. One of those columns is what I found, and the other is what I expected. And then I return them to their pairs so they complete each column together. And in the what I found column, they're supposed to put what they actually found as part of the scavenger hunt. But then in the what I expected column, they put what they thought they were going to find or what they had believed beforehand, which sometimes is I never even really even thought about it. And then after that, after the pairs have had some time to work together to create that chart, I reconvene the class again and ask the duos to share their found and expected columns, especially if they thought it was surprising or if it would be of interest to the class. And then for each of those shares, I ask, and what cultural messages have you received that you think led you to expecting what you did in the expected column? And so that's a way of saying, where does that come from that you would expect that? And then if the duo can unpack it, you can also ask others to join in on sharing those cultural messages that might be what contributed to that expectation. So in addition to the expectations and the discussions of the what was expected versus what they found, there's some other discussion prompts that I give. So one prompt is, some facts about families seem to be harder to find than others. Why do you think that is? Another good prompt is, did any duos disagree on what to put in the expected column? And so you can see that even though there might be differences in what people expected, there could be different differences for different people. I also like to ask, did you have a hard time figuring out what terms or search strings to enter to find this information? Because a lot of them are doing this via Google search or through some other mechanism on their phones or on a laptop. And then how do you think that plays into communication? And that's actually, they don't have a ton to say there. They have some things to say, but this is kind of a lead in to getting students to think about those cultural messages for family types. And so what I like to do is take some of those family types that were listed in the scavenger hunt and enter them as a Google image search, and then have the class discuss what we find there. So one example of that, you could enter a divorced family into Google and do an image search, and then here are the actual images that came up for this search that I did about an hour ago. And so as you can see here, there's lots of different images, but they all seem to be sad, right? So you have the kid who's lying his head on his arm, and then his parents are fighting in the background. You have another kid who's kind of in a tug of war. And actually, there is a family communication study where children were asked to draw divorce, and this was an actual picture that one of the children drew. And so you can see that there's lots of different images that help to shape how we think about divorce, right? And so the Google Image Finder helps us to see that. And then there are other aspects that you can unpack as well. For instance, all the families seem to be white and middle class in these images. And so is there anything there? And so you can really get the class into thinking about, where do we get these cultural messages about what makes families different? All right, that's what I've got for this session. This makes a nice little segue though into session number 3, which is thinking about normative and non-normative families. And so that's actually different than thinking about different families, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next session. In the meantime, thank you so much for coming to session number 2. If you have anything that you want to say to me or you think I should know, email it to me, jimmiem@unr.edu. That's jimmiem@unr.edu. And then don't forget to check out the course readings if you haven't done that already, as well as the assignment overviews and the other videos that are available. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.